This video will show you how I bring all the components of a DIY ecosystem pond together. These ponds are my personal ponds, and all were created using DIY filters to minimize costs. Keep in mind, I'm not a professional. The idea is to show that an average person can create a decent outcome. In the video, I'll talk about how to dig the pond, what products I use to line the pond, how to position rocks and pebble inside the pond. I'll go over how I construct any streams or creeks, the building and plumbing of the bog filters, constructing the intake bays and connecting them to bog filters, and then finishing off the edges and gardens. If you don't already know me, my name is Kev, and the aim of my channel is to help people build and maintain ponds without spending a fortune. If that sounds like something that interests you, feel free to subscribe and check out my website, Ozponds.com. So this video is going to show the actual construction phases of an ecosystem pond. I did just make a video explaining how to design and size all the different components. I'll link that video in the description if you haven't seen it, and don't already know how to size your bog filter, intake bay, the pump, the plumbing lines, etc. That video will cover all of those things and allow me to just focus on the building for this video. So once your plan is in place, the first construction step is actually digging out the pond. As you excavate the pond, you should be creating shelves. The shelves allow large rocks to easily be positioned on the vertical sides of the shelf, and smaller pebble or gravel can be positioned on the horizontal part of the shelf. This means that when it comes to stacking the rocks, you give them a nice sturdy foundation. You can wedge in smaller rocks to fill gaps between larger rocks and then backfill with pebble or gravel to provide added stability and even planting pockets for aquatic plants. This is also handy if you need to stack large rocks on top of large rocks. Backfilling with the gravel or pebble gives you a solid foundation for the next layer of rock. When it comes to how deep each shelf should be, I let my overall depth determine that. In all my ponds I've gone for 3 shelves. I like it and I think it looks good. You of course can add more or less. So as an example, this pond is 60 centimetres or 2 foot deep. So I dug out each shelf a little over 20 centimetres deep or about 8 inches. It's always a good idea to over-excavate a little because the rock and pebble will shrink the final size and depth. So the 3 shelves at a little over 20 centimetres or 8 inches gets me my 60 centimetres or 2 foot of depth. This pond is much deeper at 1.2 metres or 4 foot. So on this pond, I took each shelf down a little over 60 centimetres or 2 foot. I think while you're digging, you should also consider having some areas of the shelves wider than other parts and some areas where there are deeper drop-offs. Mixing it up makes it easier to make it look more natural. Digging in the shelves still gives you plenty of freedom to add in steps or beach areas. While you are digging, you want to keep the shelves level. I don't use any special tools, just a common spirit level. I then find that I can use the excavated soil to contour the levels around the pond to set the final water level. While you're digging the pond, you also want to dig out your filter zones. The size of these is determined by what you worked out during the planning phase. This is the intake zone on my largest pond. When I build my intake bays, I like to have a hump of dirt or create a shallow shelf that creates a shallow zone for water to be pulled over into the pumps. This pull of water over the shallow section creates surface tension, and that's what pulls the floating debris into the intake bay. An alternative is to build the intake bay inside the pond and use a matrix block like aqua blocks, eco blocks, or even milk crates to create an artificial shelf or shallow zone. But you do need to use a liner or geofabric to restrict water flow through the front of the blocks and force it up over the top to create that water tension. And then we have the bog filters. Sometimes you'll dig these and sometimes you won't. My larger volume bog filters are dug out because it's the easiest and cheapest way to create a large filter. On the smaller ponds, I'm happy to use containers that will hold enough volume of water for what I determined during the planning stage. Even then, I'll make sure that I know where they are going and I'll work on concealing them during the digging phase. You can use any type of container that will meet your water volume needs. Just make sure that it won't deteriorate over time. Things like stock troughs, old bathtubs, IBCs and food-grade storage containers can make great bog filters. So that pretty much covers the digging out aspect of the pond and filters. Now let's talk liner and underlayment. My opinion is that EPDM rubber is your best choice for an ecosystem pond. It's stretchy, which is great when placing large heavy rocks. It's been proven to last, and it's easy to work with and repair. I will also often use a non-woven geotextile underlayment to provide a soft cushion for the liner. And on my largest pond, that I put a lot of time, effort and money into, I also placed the geotextile over the top of the liner. I really didn't want to move some of these big rocks ever again. On most of the other ponds, I just placed the geotextile under some of the larger rocks before putting them in place. Another thing, I tend not to order my liner until I've completely dug out the pond and filters. Plans change, and I prefer to take time and look at the excavation and figure out if I'm 100% happy before committing to the expense of the liner. The liner is always my single biggest expense on a pond, and I don't want to be fully committed to a size or shape until I'm totally happy. When ordering liner, you work the length out as length plus 2 times the depth, and the width is the width plus 2 times the depth. And then I like to add a foot or 2 to each side to allow an overhang and flexibility. And if you're creating an intake bay, you need to add the hump/shallow zone. Because the liner goes up and back down over the hump, we need to account for that extra liner. That's just something to be aware of. So while I'm talking about intake bays, we should discuss the construction. The pumps sit inside a vault. The idea of the vault is to provide a port to access the pumps. Here I'm using olive barrels to create the port. You also want to create a void space that the pumps can draw water from. Here I'm using a large diameter half pipe used in septic leach field trenches. The void space is handy to have, as you never want the pumps to be starved of water. Something small like a skimmer can get clogged easily with leaves, and that can prevent enough water reaching the pump. These leaves need to be removed frequently. The intake bay is much larger and has the void space so it can accommodate large quantities of leaves, and even if it's neglected for long periods of time, it shouldn't clog and starve the pumps of water. I've also used a green wheelie bin to act as a pump vault. Whatever you choose to use as the vault, you'll create a way for the water to pass through the void area into the vault, and from there it can be pumped to the bog filter, jets or stream, depending on the situation. Cobbles are placed over the void area. Larger rocks can be used to make it all look more natural, and then smaller pebbles can be placed over the cobble. The smaller pebbles help trap larger particles that could potentially clog the pumps, whereas the cobbles have larger gaps so they can allow the water to flow through easily. The pumps inside the intake bay should very rarely need to be cleaned or checked, as the rock, cobble and pebble is an excellent pre-filter. However, it's still a good idea to make access easy. On this pond, I decided to have the vaults completely submerged. This was a mistake. If I want to access the pumps, I really need to drop the water level inside the entire pond. So on this pond, I kept the lid to the vault high and dry, and access isn't an issue. Although I do need to do a better job of hiding the vault/bin. I do have some rock paint. I've just been too lazy to get it done. But anyway, this is a better option in my opinion. Okay, so that should cover the intake bay construction. Now we can move on to the bog filter construction. No matter if the bog is a lined excavation or a container, I pretty much construct them exactly the same way. It's only really the method of draining and cleaning that might change. I always pipe the water in over the top of the bog. I'll never bring it in to the base of the bog, even if it's a container filter. If you do, it makes it really hard to prevent siphoning if the pump's shut off. You'll notice there's a piece of pipe labelled breather pipe. This allows air to be sucked into the pipe when the pump shuts off. We don't want the bog filter to siphon empty because it's capturing small solid materials that make it through the intake bay. This material is so fine that as it builds up, it looks like sludge. We really don't want the sludge returning to the pond should the pump shut off, and we want to be able to remove it from the bog filter every so often. So on most container bogs, I'll add a clean-out valve at the base. The excavation will slope slightly down to this clean-out barrel. On the larger excavated and lined bogs, I'll have a clean-out barrel at the opposite end of where the water flows into the bog. The idea being that when the time comes, a dirty water pump can be placed in here to remove all that accumulated sludgy stuff I was talking about. In another of my bogs, I've used just a piece of 100mm or 4-inch pipe to create the clean-out portal. This is because I can fit my pond vacuum down there, and this smaller pipe is easier to hide than the barrel. But anyway, no matter what type of bog filter, the water is piped in over the top, water is dispersed along the bottom of the filter, and then it flows up through various sizes of rock and pebble. Here's another angle of how that looks. The water moves up through the different layers of rock and pebble. I've labelled the different sizes on this graphic. And here's how it looks in real life. You can see the clean-out barrel, the pipe up the other end, that's where the water is being pumped in from the intake bay, and I'm in the process of adding the last layer of pebble over the top of the dispersal pipe. You can then add in larger rocks, pieces of wood, and start to naturalise it. So it all starts with just the basic excavation, size based on the volume we determined during the design phase. We add in our dispersal pipe, clean-out barrel or port, the inflow pipe, and cover it with rock and pebble. Then we naturalise it with rock, wood, and plants. So once the intake bay and bogs are constructed and the rocks are in on the lower shelves, I like to fill the pond so that I can connect the intake bay to the bog and start pumping water. There's lots of different pipes and fittings you can use to connect the intake bay and bog filters. It doesn't really matter what you use, so long as it's going to withstand your environment and it's sized appropriately to the amount of water you'll be pumping. And I guess while we're here, we should talk about streams or creeks. Then we can talk about finishing off the edges and gardens. I think a really important part of building a stream is having plenty of liner to work with. I just start by placing in some rocks and getting a general shape with a few twists and turns. I didn't mention it before, but whenever I can, I like to run my plumbing lines inside the liner. And anywhere where you want to have a waterfall or just somewhere where the water moves over the surface of a rock, you'll need to use waterfall foam. You'll notice I just use the generic expandable foam, not the expensive stuff, and it works fine, no issues with fish, and you don't even notice it as the stream matures. Anyway, once the main rocks are set, the sides of the liner can be lifted and the dirt brought up to hold it all in place. Then you can add in the smaller pebble for the stream bottom and get creative with the plants. If you need to create big sweeping bends, you can use multiple liners. The trick is making sure that each piece overlaps and falls enough to prevent any water being able to escape. If you haven't got enough fall, you can use seam tape to splice the EPDM rubber together and create a watertight seal. On this stream, I had plenty of fall, but I still added in some Firestone lap sealant just to be safe. I don't think my streams are the best, and I do think it's worth watching the experts if you want to create something epic. Having said that, you are limited in what's achievable by the amount of flow you have to work with. Okay, now the edges. I'm sure you've noticed as I show the ponds in various stages of construction that there's water in them. Because I don't have any Fandangle levelling apparatus, I'm not 100% sure where my final water level's going to end up. Also, by getting water into the pond as soon as possible, I get weight onto the liner, which will prevent any bubbling of the liner from any water that's percolating out of the ground. Anyway, now I can take my time and get all the edges set and at the right levels while the pond is running. I find this especially useful around any streams or waterfalls where you've used foam. These are often the spots where you can find low edges or spots where the water is pooling unexpectedly and escaping the liner. When I'm doing the edges, I'm trying to have the liner 15 centimetres or half a foot above the water's surface. To achieve a neat edge, you really need to trim the liner. This can be hard as the liner is so expensive, but it's got to be done. I'm then going along, folding the liner back on itself, so I have a small amount to play with in the future if the ground settles more than I expected. I'm backfilling with nice topsoil, up to an inch or so below the liner fold. I can then cover the little bead of the liner with pebble or mulch and add some plants. Over time, as the plants grow, there'll be no visible liner. So I've tried to make this video as a good overview on how anyone can create an ecosystem pond without spending a fortune. If you want to see how any of the individual ponds were constructed and go into more detail, I'll link them in the description along with the pond design video. If there's something that I left out or didn't cover properly, I apologise, and just let me know in the comments and I'll try and send a link to a video that will help explain that aspect of the build. And remember, if you need help to size the filters, the plumbing, the pumps, etc., you can find that info at ozponds.com. I do hope this video was helpful and not too boring. If you thought it was helpful, feel free to tickle the thumbs up button. Anyway, thanks for watching. See ya.